Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm doing the 25.14 mid-lane tier list surf driver content. Like, subscribe, and let's get into it. This was a relatively small patch, albeit there were some notable changes. Some of the high-end champions being nerfed with the likes of Yasuo, Twisted Fate, and Zoe. They buffed items like Bork, Kraken Slayer, and a slight mana buff towards Roa. They also buffed up Ziggs, Azir, and Fizz. And then some other things have kind of been adjusted. Yunara has been added to the game. She looks to have landed slightly on the weaker side at the moment, but things will change around this champion, I imagine. I'll kind of cover a bit more in depth when I get to her. And yeah, let's get into it. So, actually, leading off, we're going to start with Yunara. I'm going to run the detail in the moment. Obviously, she is a champion which long term will most likely be balanced for bot lane. She doesn't have the same kind of similarities as maybe like Smolder on release, where solo lane Smolder looked like a pretty promising pick alongside bot lane Smolder. Yunara solo lane win rate is considerably lower than Yunara duo lane win rate. I would recommend really trying this champion in like normals and just like practicing her before taking her onto live. I think she is a bit on the weaker side at the moment, maybe substantially on the weaker side. It does kind of differ from champion to champion with new releases, which makes it kind of hard to predict how these things are going to land. But she does have a level of mastery to her. A lot of her empowered abilities are auto attack resets, and that can enable her to do some pretty like unique combos and pretty large amounts of like damage output. But you do need to have put the time into her, making sure you're executing these correctly, as that is going to be the difference probably long term when it comes to playing a champion like this. There are different item builds floating around. I recommend trying Kraken. I believe it is bugged at the moment on her, like it's like overperforming because it's bugged. The other options are things like Towers. That seems to be the other main first item option. AP variants and AP on hit variants don't look to be performing that well. Whether like Riot go and adjust that long term will be interesting to see. But right now, though, I wouldn't recommend playing her in the mid lane. I'd recommend just completely avoiding the champion, as I would traditionally with like new releases. Playing them for the first 2 weeks traditionally is just not a consistent way of climbing unless you are really just using it as like a practice realm, which then you. Well, I mean, then you're probably like swapping, and it probably doesn't matter where the placement of the champion is. Anyway, I digress. You know, I'm going to leave her in the D tier at the moment. I just don't recommend playing her in the mid lane. Some of the other D tier champions which I don't recommend are the likes of Ezreal and Varus. These two picks just underperform quite heavily in mid lane in solo queue. They're unpopular. I mean, rightfully so. They don't perform that well. They struggle into a lot of the mages. They're quite punishable. Well, in Varus' case, he's a better solo laner than Ezreal. Like, I think Ezreal does just like Ezreal, even in his current state, isn't that amazing of a champion. Varus on top, obviously, tends to be his more popular second, role compared to just the bot lane variant, where you are playing traditionally the on hit or like a more tankier style build. Mid lane, you traditionally see like the AP variant of Varus come out, and raw AP Varus hasn't been great for a while now. They nerfed his big W damage on this champion a while ago, back when he was like one-shotting tanks pretty comfortably, like without actually having a huge amount of AP. Doesn't do that as much anymore. Not quite as egregious as back then. Just a pick I wouldn't really recommend, as are some of the other D tier champions. Okay, so the problem is, so I do have Smolder, Tristana, and Corki here, which you might wonder, why do you have these champions here? I see them in competitive, or I see them in elite solo queue. Well, these champions traditionally do perform better in these more controlled environments where you are getting a larger pool of resources and people are kind of playing around what these champions do. That being said, though, they're not that popular at the moment. Corki's had a bit of a resurgence with some like bruisery variants with like Shogun Rush and like Overlord's Bloodmail, which do bump him up slightly if you can find the right games to go them in. I don't really recommend these picks in solo queue though at the moment. I think they are either too resource hungry, you need to execute them really well, you're kind of reliant on your jungler playing around you, and that doesn't end up being a pretty consistent win con. Albeit, in Elite, I think the champions perform better. I think a lot of the kind of like lower C, D tier options do perform better the higher MMR you go, as they traditionally are more reliant on either execution or certain kind of things within the game which you're just not going to get access to in low MMR brackets. And these picks kind of mirror some of that. I mean, Yone, Smolder, traditionally seen as a counter pick into Yone. I believe Chovy played it recently as like an option. Even back Worlds last year, for example, was kind of something which was prevalent then. overall, yeah, I think if you can make these champions work, they do have spots where you can play them. These three champions specifically. Azir and Ziggs were the other two champions of the D tier. They've obviously jumped this patch. They got buffed. And yeah, these are going to be the three other champions within the D tier. Actually, yeah, they are. Okay, so moving on to the C tier then. I've removed Nidalee. Obviously, Nidalee mid was like a pretty small stint. It gained popularity. It lost its popularity quite quickly. I still think it has spots where it can work. Obviously, if you pair alongside a hyper carry, you pilot the champion well, people still find success with it. For mid to low elo though, I don't really recommend it. You're probably best looking towards other options, but it is still something which is there, prevalent, and if like can be in the back of your mind if it is something you are comfortable playing. Gangplank leads off the C tier. Champion's in a pretty fine spot now ever since its most recent set of buffs in 25.13, specifically for like your OTPs. Gangplank's never really been that good for just general audiences, especially mid and lower MMR brackets. You're looking at like your high elo, like making sure you're like comboing correctly with the barrels, trading lane like accordingly, and then making sure you're maximizing or like efficiently getting your ultimates when you can. Just things I don't really recommend like learning at like a mid to low level. If you're going to play Gangplank, you're gonna have to sink a huge amount of time into him because you have to execute him well to really get the value out of this champion compared to just opting into a different pick. Same goes for like your Jaces, for example. Jace performs a lot better in higher MMR brackets because he is a very hard champion to pilot. He's also a lane bully, and that also traditionally treads towards those higher MMR bracket players. Brand sits in the C tier. He's not a high MMR champion. He's just not very good. He sits in the C tier at the moment, as I recommend other AP burn mages or dot mages over him. He, as a champion, has suffered through like item nerfs. They tried to bring him back as like a jungler not too long ago. Didn't really go wholeheartedly on it. He's kind of just ended up being mediocre, and for the bracket of play where he should be best, I just don't really recommend him at the moment, so I have him in the C tier. Kassadin, I think, as a niche counter pick can be fine. I don't really recommend this champion because I think he is dependent on already knowing how to play him and then picking him in the right spots. There have been iterations of Kassadin which have been better in the past, and the buff towards Roa this patch does help him. Like, him and Ryze sit towards the high end of the C tier. But as a champion, unless you've already sunk a lot of time into him, I just don't really recommend him as much at the moment outside of like those counter pick scenarios. Yone still underperforms even with the Borg buffs. I thought maybe he would jump a tier, but it doesn't seem to have come to fruition. He's still kind of pro-gelled in the mid lane at the moment, which is quite interesting to see because he's been pushed in that direction almost, because Yone on release, and even for like the first 2 years, wasn't quite as egregiously in the spot, but he is kind of considered the main AD like facilitator at the moment, where you can play an AP jungler alongside him, and then Yone is considered number one. This is because they've wiped out things like your Tristanas, your Corkis. Jace is more prevalent as a top laner. It's either banned traditionally if you're like looking for those flex angles. So it's all kind of interesting to see how that's ended up happening. He sits on the high end of the C tier. If you're very comfortable playing him, you can still make him work. If you're not, then I would really just recommend avoiding him at the moment. Kiana just requires an insane level of execution to work with at the moment. You can pilot her at like your diamond master levels, but you need to have basically OTP'd this champion to kind of really get the value out of the pick over like other AD or just general assassin options in the mid lane at the moment. Mel is hindered by the fact that people still Q-Max over E-Max. If E-Max Mel was like the main way of playing her, or like people mainly opted into that, she probably sits as a low A tier option. Right now I have in the C tier because people just don't do it enough, and it's hard to kind of rate a champion which people just aren't playing. So like the way a champion is without people actually playing it. So yeah, I have in the C tier at the moment. Royce also sits in the C tier. He benefited from the Aurora buffs this patch. I mean, they're trying to un-elite skew him at the moment, but they, at some point, inadvertently did elite skew him. They gave him some early game buffs, and it made him a bit too dominant and competitive. They nerfed him because of his competitive dominance, so he didn't take over MSI. And now he sits for solo queue as like a low B, high C tier option. I might bump him up next patch, but for the moment, I do have him as a high C tier option. I also have Azir as a C tier option. The buff this patch was really nice for him. They nerfed him because they were concerned about MSI. He was still prevalent pretty heavily during MSI. They buffed him this patch. I believe it was 25 base health and 5% AP ratio on his W, which is exactly what he needs. So those are the buffs which benefit Azir the most as a champion. I would recommend learning him if you want to learn him at the moment. I still don't recommend him for solo queue though. Like, this champion's incredibly hard to pilot, and the environment you find in solo queue isn't the same environment as you would be provided with in like a competitive scenario. So do with that what you will. Don't play the champion unless you're very, very comfortable on him, because he is an incredibly hard champion to pilot. So I'd recommend other things still over him. But he's in this spot where if you want to learn him, then he's in a good learnable spot now. Moving on to the B tier, then we lead off with Morgana. A fine mid-elo niche counter pick. I don't really recommend the champion, albeit there have been builds popping up, I believe, recently. I'm trying to remember what the build is off the top of my head. I can't remember, but there have been like well, why can't I remember the item even? Like, Morgana, the way I perceive Morgana is you can play her if you're comfortable with her, and you use her as like a niche counter pick. Outside of that, you're probably not going to play Morgana, but she's mid to low elo skewed. Garen benefited from the Phantom Dancer buffs this patch. He's more playable. The 2% movement speed is obviously going to be more meaningful for a champion like Garen, so he can stick to his targets. He still isn't the same power as he was like for the damage loss, which he like has received in this current iteration. If they go and buff him at some point though, I would definitely recommend picking the champion up though. But unless you're an OTP, I just wouldn't recommend him at the moment. Sion doesn't really have the agency I would like to recommend a champion with, albeit he is one of the best Stonewall champions, if not just outright the best Stonewall champion in the game. So if you are looking to neutralize or just win lane, Sion is a great option for you. If you want to carry games, don't play Sion. It's not that kind of champion. Even with like the opt-in to like the Titanics and Overlords, traditionally you'd just be better off playing a different champion then. But it does exist if you are looking for it. Malphite is a bit in the beta. He's very easy to play. He has the AP and the tank variants. I think maybe I'm a bit harsh on Malphite, but I do think he is incredibly dependent on like your R5 spots, especially when playing mid, because if you run into a Silas, for example, you will traditionally just lose the game. That is just how the dynamic of that matchup goes. Well, not even the matchup, just like these two champions interacting with each other in the game. Ari isn't doing as well at the moment. She ended up being competitively jailed. They nerfed her for competitive, and I mean, she was performing in solo queue as well, and now she kind of just sits as like a meh champion. I think you can still make her work, but she's definitely not the same level of power that she has been in previous iterations. Tilia sits in the B tier, an incredibly powerful competitive pick. I believe she is still considered number one, or at least like up there as like a T1 mid lane pick, alongside Kira's, even your Annie's at the moment. Like, I'm pretty sure Annie's perceived as being like quite high up there. Talia with the Pantheon pairing especially is like a really valuable pick. You're not going to see that as much in solo queue, albeit you are still going to pair traditionally alongside your AD junglers. Talia sits as more of a B tier option. I don't really recommend her as much because some of the like aspects of her kit, which like make her really strong competitive, just aren't as valuable or aren't going to be as exploited within solo queue environments. Zed and like once again, like a lot of these assassins, like your Talons, your Zeds, your Akshans, these picks perform really well if you pilot them, like if you're very good at piloting them. If you don't, I don't recommend them as much, but sink the time into them, you'll be rewarded. That is just the main thing with some of these assassin options, especially the AD ones. Some of the AP ones are actually just better, more generalistically, and not as dependent on OTPing, albeit like every champion traditionally benefits from having a lot of mastery on it. Lissandra, I think as a counter pick is fine. She's seen better days, though she's not a high option. She sits towards the low end of the B tier. They've been close at times, but right now, yeah, sits in the middle of the pack as like a mid to low B tier option. I think Aso is spots where he can work quite nicely, especially in mid to low elo, where you're not going to get punished as traditionally for picking this champion. But if you blind him, there are lots of hard matchups, and the buff towards Fizz this patch probably drops him some places down, because Fizz is one of the biggest counters towards ASO at the moment, and like throughout all of this newer iteration of ASO, it's a really polarizing matchup. LeBlanc sits in the B tier, another pick which kind of like lingers in this assassin squad, where if you've sunk a lot of time to them, you really understand your lethals, you have the mastery, they can be really powerful picks. If you haven't, you're probably better off looking towards other thing. They are mastery sinks, they are like reliant on understanding those lethal thresholds. Silas sits in the B tier. I think he's in a pretty solid spot at the moment. Good counter pick. Yeah, if you just play him in the right spots, you can get value out of this champion. There are different builds kind of floating around. Like we've seen some like Protobout, some Roa variants, some just outright Storm Surge Burst variants. I think it comes down to what you feel comfortable with playing in the game. If you prefer those Bruiser variants as maybe you're a bit more stable with them and they're not as reliant on explosive games, then they can be quite good as options there for you. Orianna has definitely risen in popularity recently. I think pairing her alongside some of the AD jungle pool at the moment has really like kind of brought rise to this champion. Definitely like for MSI kind of shown the value of the champion. Shockwave is an incredibly powerful ultimate. Just the trading pattern and the way this champion pilots for early to mid game can be really important in like just some of the key learning points of mid lane. So I do recommend Orianna. Like I really value this champion as an option. She's not above the bar in my opinion because I think she actually requires a lot of depth of knowledge to really make use of her, and you have to maximize like your trading and laning phase. But then like, you can also look at it the other way, where if you just want to be an ultimate bot, then Orianna kind of can in certain situations. You throw the ball on someone, you get a multi-man shockwave. This pick can usually get good value. So I think she's a high beta option. Maybe you could argue that she should be in the A tier somewhere. Aurora sits in the B tier. Recent buffs to her helped her quite a bit. She's more survivable in lane. She does more damage on her ultimate. Pretty solid. I mean, the big problem with Aurora at the moment is she's just quite elite skewed, and maybe long term that's not what Riot want, but right now they seem to be happy with the state she's in. Sits as a high B tier for like average solo queue. Climbs quite aggressively though into those higher MMR brackets. Cassiopeia, this champion isn't. I'm not sold on Cassiopeia at the moment. Especially with the MSI like track record she had where she's very punishable. She's not quite as strong as she has been in previous iterations. She's definitely lost damage in spaces. The nerf towards Roa and the nerf towards Seraph were also quite meaningful for her. Roa got buffed this patch. Should probably claw some of that back, so maybe she does sit towards the high end of the beta at the moment. But I'd say use her as a counter pick sparingly. I don't think she's in. She might even be one of the worst states she's been in for like the last couple of years. But when Cassiopeia has traditionally been an above the bar champion, she's always been quite a performant option. Gragas sits within the B tier. I think the pick pretty solid as an AP burst mage at the moment. There are Protobelt variants which kind of exist at in this current iteration, which do give him good agency. I've played Protobelt Gragas top. It's quite fun. you can just have some of these really high kind of dopamine moments where you can you just have like really good agency. You can do a lot of damage. You have lots of burst potential. Yeah, I think the pick has good value, especially if you've sunk a lot of time into him. Really understand the combos of the champion. Vel'Koz sits in the B tier at the moment. He's a fine artillery mage. I don't rate him above Xerath. Like, I will almost always rate Xerath above Vel'Koz because I think Xerath is a bit more reliable. But if you've got the depth of knowledge on Vel'Koz, he's an incredibly good champion. So that's why I'd say the differences between the two picks. Mastery on Vel'Koz, and then if you want something a bit more traditional, I think maybe Xerath might have the edge over him. They're not too far away from each other. Like, you could easily swap one in for the other, but I personally just recommend Xerath over Vel'Koz in his current state. Moving up to the A tier then, so I'm going to lead off with Ziggs. Actually, one more pick within B tier. Twist of Fate got nerfed this patch. They took away 10 damage off of his Q. So basically we went full revert on the buff, which like made him really super strong. It's quite funny to see. Did they need to do this? Maybe not. Like, the spellbook nerf this patch might have been enough in higher MMR brackets to kind of like put him back in line. They obviously opted into the nerf as well. In lower MMR brackets, he doesn't perform that well anymore. I'd probably just recommend avoiding him again. But he's there. I actually don't think Riot know how they want to go about Twisted Fate, because this champion will have like 3 or 4 patches where he's really good, or like one of the best mid laners in the game, and then he'll go back to being mediocre or just bad for the rest of the year. So it's unfortunate for him. I'm going to leave him in the low B tier. Maybe he drops down to the C tier. Maybe he rises back up to the A tier as people hop off of him or people refine the builds. It can really differ, but yeah, I'm not going to recommend him as much anymore. Moving on to the 8 events. So there are there's 2 champions which I'm moving up, and one is Ziggs. So Ziggs has made the jump from Vegeta's to the A tier. You can maybe argue he should actually be a B tier option. I've seen some kind of like talk around this champion. Obviously, he's perceived as being very strong in the bot lane, and bot lane Ziggs looks really good. Like, I would really recommend playing him there. He's definitely one of the top performers at the moment, especially in high and like competitive MMR brackets. For mid lane, he's a bit. He had a long way to go. He was a really bad champion. He was just unreliable and didn't really do enough damage. But now he's gained a lot more damage. Not really fixed the reliability issue, but that doesn't really matter when you have like a bucket load more damage. So I'm going to have him in the A tier at the moment, pending. He now sits a bit more in line with the other artillery options, just a little less reliable, but does have some really, really high burst and like high damage moments. So yeah, sits as a low A tier option at the moment, pending. The other pick I'm moving up is Fizz. I think Fizz as a counter pick is really good. He's still not there as like a blind option. Like, he does have really tough matchups, and traditionally a lot of the blind pick or like the champions which he really punishes just aren't as popular like your Syndras and your ASOS are. They exist, people will play them and sometimes blind them, but they're not like a top tier blind option. And it's like Orianna isn't great for Fizz, like you don't really want to be playing Fizz in that matchup as like one of the like perceived less mobile mages, or just outright mobile mages. So I'm gonna have him as a low A2 option. He's definitely better. The buffs this patch were just straight up power, and they were power in spots which were quite nice for him. But he's still not amazing, and you're still only really going to play him if you're an OTP. Aurelia, I'm going to have... I'll talk about Aurelia towards the higher end of the A tier. Cho'Gath, I've kind of been debating dropping him down to the B tier. Like, mid lane Cho'Gath really hasn't been that performant for a while. Like, one patch of, like, dropping performance is fine. Like, that happens. Like, certain champions can go through that. This is like the 3rd patch running where Cho'Gath mid hasn't looked quite as good as he has done in the past. So I'm going to make the decision to drop him down to the B tier. I think in the right spots he can still be really good, especially against matchups where he can really scale. You can get a lot of feast stacks into compositions where you can get a lot of value out, like his knock-up or his silence. I think those spots can still be really good for him. But just as a general mid lane pick, I just don't think he's quite as good anymore. So I don't really recommend him quite as much. Vex, I still have on the A tier. I think she's a great counter pick option, especially in some of the highly mobile picks and like assassins, which can't really consistently dive onto you because of like the way your W and like your fear interacts with them. That being said, though, you can't really buy the champion. She is dependent on those counter pick scenarios, so sits as like a low A tier option. Once again, another pick which traditionally you won't see out of like outside of like OTPs or people who've played a lot of the champion and understand why it's a good counter pick. Quinn, they're nerfing her in 25.15. I'm not surprised. Quinn in both mid and top has kind of been in a really strong spot for a while. Maybe not like she's really unpopular, which is why maybe she didn't need to be nerfed, and you could kind of leave her in that state. Like, same goes for Nyla. Like, these champions support really high win rates, but aren't perceived quite... they're just unpopular, which is why they aren't perceived as being, like, instant nerf champions. That being said, though, Static Shiv, Profane Hydra, both these items have looked really good on as like rush options on Quinn. She generally has just performed really well in both these roles for a while now with like the Symbiotic Souls Rush. Like, she's one of the few champions which maybe even just like the only champion which still kind of does it. And yeah, she has been performing quite well for a while now. So I do have her as an A tier. She's probably actually like an S tier, maybe even an S plus option if like people actually paid her. But she's being nerfed going into next patch. Anivia will benefit from the Royal Buffs this patch. Once again, it's 100 mana on the item. I don't imagine any of these champions are going to jump a tier. Outside of maybe Kassadin and Ryze, they might actually jump up to the line of the B tier going into next patch. But Anivia, I'm going to leave her in the A tier for the moment. I think if you're comfortable playing the champion, she's still in a pretty good spot. Just not quite as overpowered as she has been in like pre-nerf to Seraph and pre-nerf to Roa iterations. Neeko had some bug fixes this patch to stop her from being able to extend her clone duration quite as egregiously. Generally, for like average audiences, that doesn't really matter because people weren't really exploiting that. For Elite, she's definitely weaker though. Like, Elite support and mid lane Neeko are weaker champions. Average, Neeko, still really strong, oppressive early game. Still has a really powerful ultimate if you play around your, like, clone correctly. That that traditionally does end up being the differentiator, but I'd still like sell her as a pretty solid A tier option. Veigar is a good mid-low elo champion. He doesn't perform very well in high MMR brackets, which is why I traditionally don't really recommend him quite as much, but this is the elo bracket he does best in, and for that, I do him as a pretty solid A tier option. Annie has been gaining popularity, especially in elite MMR brackets. Like, she's definitely like doing better higher up with like the hard CC. The power kind of shifted towards her kit away from Tibbers. Is meaningful. That does mean quite a bit. Average elo, still, yeah, solid option. I still recommend playing her if you are looking for a champion with like really good lockdown. If you're looking for a summon champion, I think the archetype is maybe not quite. You don't really have true summons in League. I feel like a lot of the time they have been pretty heavily siphoned out of the summon, so the base kit's quite powerful. I mean, they did it recently with Yorick, we've done it with Ivan, they've done it with Annie at this point, and you can kind of see they're not quite a big fan of giving power to these summons. That being said, though, yeah, she's an option there for you if that's the kind of thing you enjoy, but not maybe quite the top end of the S tier, because she has definitely lost some of her scaling, which did make her better in these lower MMR brackets. Neferi, this is a high A2 option at the moment. Definitely with the play rate of the champion going down, and both jungle and mid will lead to people not understanding how to play against it quite as well, and it will benefit like your OTPs for people who've sunk a lot of time into the champion and will be rewarded for it. So I think she's definitely benefited from that. I don't think she's quite an S tier option, albeit the like only spoiler, but like I've dropped Yasuo down. The only S tier AD option I now have is Pantheon, and I probably just recommend Pantheon most of the time if you're looking for an AD mid laner, because he's a bit easier than, he's a lot easier than some of the other options. I think Pantheon just in general is a pretty slept on mid lane option, but I'll talk about him when I get there. High Mininger, I think people have begun to catch on a bit. Maybe I've just seen a lot of high middingers recently, which is why I've kind of been deluded into this thought, but I do think people are like realizing this champion's really strong in his current state, especially when you give him a lot of AP. Like, Heimerdinger's got an incredibly oppressive laning phase, some really absurd burst angles, which most people just won't expect. Like, I get consistently caught out by Heimerdinger burst angles, because you just don't play against the champion a lot. It's kind of the same with Clyde, especially the old iteration of Clyde, which had an absurd amount of damage, especially if you like understood how to use it and how to get the most out of it. But Heimerdinger, yeah, I mean, this champion I think is slept on. I would recommend trying it if you haven't already. But he traditionally ends up being played by like a pretty niche audience, as his kit is pretty unique in the way it operates. Katarina, riding high off the AP item buffs. I still basically never recommend this champion unless you're an OTP. Like, Katarina is probably the most OTP dependent mid laner in the game. If you haven't already played her, I mean, like, if you don't play Katarina, she's like a D tier option. If you play Katarina, she's probably the best pick you can go to at the moment. So it's pretty funny when you kind of think about it in solo queue. But yeah, I mean, Katarina, doesn't really matter where I play her. I won't recommend her unless you're an OTP. Syndra sits in the A tier. I think Syndra's a solid option. I like these like standard AP mages. I think they enable you to kind of have a pretty core pool, which you can kind of like move between. Like, if you've got like a Syndra, Orianna, Victor pool, for example, I think that can be quite a nice like options there for you, which you can kind of opt in and opt out of depending on what you need. Talking about some of these traditional options, Yue, I'm going to kind of sit next to these ones, and like your Victor. I think if you're very comfortable piloting these champions, they can all be pretty good options there for you at the moment. They're more traditional. Do I bump Ori up? I'm going to bump Ori up. I like Ori as an option, but even though I think she might not be quite as strong or as consistent as some of these other options, or you need it to get a bit more out of the champion, I do recommend her alongside these A tier options, so I'll put her there for the moment. I might change my mind going into next patch and move her back down to the B tier, but for the moment, yeah, I'd have her as an A tier option. Akali, another champion which I really recommend learning, I think is an AP assassin. She's one of the easier, not easy, but like one of the more accessible picks. Not quite the same level of mastery curve as like your LeBlancs and your Katarinas, for example. She's a lot more accessible, and I think if you sunk some games into her, you can like use her like as an anti maybe like mage option, or an anti not so much mage option, anti kind of like what's the term I'm looking for, into squishy team compositions. Really like basic hit down, then yeah, I think she can be quite valuable in those like right spots. Malzahar is a great mid to low elo champion. I don't really recommend him outside of like Diamond higher. I think he does really struggle as a champion in Master MMR brackets, because people understand how to play against his kit, and you won't get like the free chip damage, you won't be given the same level of like the same ult angles, you'll be punished for your weak laning phase, and all these things just kind of attribute the champion to being a better low elo pick than being viable in high, which you can get like, there are people who make it work, but it tends to be the people who've sunk a lot of time into the champion and understand how to kind of work around his weaknesses. Zeref, I just recommend him as a solid artillery mage. I like the champion. I think he has spots where he can be really, really powerful. Maybe not quite as high as some of these other options, because I think he's a bit niche, a bit more niche, but if you're comfortable playing him, I think he can be quite good in the current meta. Lux is slept on. Well, slept on in terms of the fact that she is stronger than most people perceive her to be, not in the fact that her play rate is still pretty high. Like, people play a lot of Lux, but this champion, I think, is in a really good spot at the moment. Definitely underrated in terms of her power level. Swain is one of the best champions you can get, best champions in the game if you can get the right spot for him. His spots aren't quite as common as some of the other options, which is why you could maybe put him beneath or put him above, depending on like how you perceive the champion, but I just recommend learning him. Like, I recommend having him as a champion within your pool, which you can use as a counter pick. Definitely up there as one of my like best counter pick options for like a mid laner pool. Zoe got nerfed this patch. It was primarily targeted towards the high MMR Zoe, which has really been taking over. Both support and mid lane Zoe were doing really well. I believe she's also incredibly prevalent in China at the moment as like one of the best mid lane options over there. Traditionally in the West, she just doesn't perform quite as well, or she isn't perceived as quite as good. That could be for like a multitude of reasons, but I'm going to have her still within like the A tier, but she's definitely a bit weaker, so I'll set her towards the mid to low end of the A tier at the moment. Maybe beneath like Nico, for example. I think that's probably a bit more reasonable of a spot. Yeah, so I'm going to drop down. He lost some power this patch. They wanted to nerf him a bit more than the Bork buffs gave him. Obviously, he would benefit from the Bork buffs, but he was already in a very performance spot, so they wanted to go a bit harder. They took away 0.5 AD growth. That's going to hurt his scaling, and it's going to hurt him, especially in mid to low elo. So I'm going to drop him down to the A tier for this patch. I still think he's a pretty solid AD option, probably like number 2, maybe even number 3. Yeah, he's probably like number 2 still, unless you play like your Nefiris or your Quins, but they are a bit more niche. Pantheon is probably just my number 1 recommended go-to at the moment. And actually, wait a minute, I missed Aurelia. Never mind. Aurelia, okay, I hate Aurelia. This is my undying hatred for this champion. She is so obnoxious in laning phase at the moment. Like, I hope the nerfs to this patch are focused towards the laning phase Aurelia, because it is borderline unassailable for 90% of the league roster. It's crazy just how powerful this champion is. That being said, though, she's incredibly hard to pilot. Like, you have to pilot this pick really well. And the difference between a good Aurelia and a bad Aurelia is how well do you pilot the mid to late game, because that will be the difference between losing a lot of games on this champion and winning a lot of games on this champion. If you cannot close out games on this pick, do not play it. If you can close out games on this pick, you should probably play it, because it is in a very strong spot at the moment, and they are going to nerf it in 25.15. That's my rant on Aurelia over. She benefited from she got buffed in like 25.13. She benefited from Bork being buffed this patch. She benefited from Kraken Slayer being buffed this patch. She got Riot specialed, and now she's going to be nerfed for it. This champion, I really don't like what they've done with it. I think Aurelia shouldn't be a guaranteed win, guaranteed lane win champion. She might just be the most polarizing lane win champion in a lot of spots, especially in top lane. It's like this champion feels borderline unassailable, especially if the enemy knows how to pilot it correctly. Moving on to the S tier then. So I'm going to leave with Kennen. Obviously, I believe it was Splinter, the French Kennen mid player who popularized this pick. And he's been doing pretty well for a while now. I'm going to bump him back up to the S tier, as I've knocked some of the S tier options down to the A and B tier. Twisted Fate and Yasuo have dropped down. So yeah, Kennen takes the spot in the S tier. I think he's in a very strong spot at the moment. He's unpopular. People won't know how to play against him. And it's to the strength of the champion. I think he's a deserving S tier option. Kayle could arguably be dropped down to the A tier. I don't think she's quite the same level of consistency as some of the other S tier options. because she is like more reliant on getting to those later points of the game. That being said though, the buff towards Nashers and the buff towards Rabadons really helped her as a champion. She's really thrived this season. I think she actually benefited this season more in top lane than she did in mid lane. Like the changes towards the way the minions interact with each other to try and, well, back when they tried to kind of get rid of lane swap in a more natural way rather than doing the lane swap detection. She benefited from those changes. For mid lane though, maybe she should be a high A tier option. I have her as a low S tier option because I do like the pick. I think the pick has spots where it can work quite nicely. I believe Desperate Nasus or Desperate Kale, whatever his name is at the moment, shows why this pick is so good, and I'd recommend watching his VODs to kind of like learn the champion or like understand how to play it in the mid lane. And yeah, I think the pick's in a really good spot at the moment. I'll talk about Pantheon next. So Pantheon is a great counter pick into a lot of the assassin pool, and a lot of the popular champions, Pantheon traditionally just runs them over. There are matchups where he would definitely struggle, but Pantheon across the board is a 4-way flex pick. You won't really know where this champion's going to go until like very late on into the draft, and that's to its strength at the moment in the mid lane. I'd recommend having it as one of the AD options within your pool, alongside maybe like a Yasuo or an Aurelia. Like Aurelia is hard to play. Yeah, Quinn, Neferi once again, quite niche options. But Pantheon, I love him as an option. Great flex pick as well. You can take him into different roles if you want to, and I have him in the S tier for that at the moment. Vladimir, I have in the S tier. I think this champ's been, gradually been on the rise for a while now, and I think people have come to appreciate just how good of an option he is in both mid and top as a counter pick. The burst potential this champion has, he's pretty unassailable in most lanes at this point, and yeah, I'd say he's a very deserving S tier option, especially with like the agency he can give you in a lot of games. Like, he has some really good 1v9 moments. Galio as a counter pick is one of the most nullifying options in the game. Yeah, obviously the prohibiting factor is the fact that he's a counter pick, but you can still opt into like burst orientated builds, like I was going to say like not Shadow Flame, albeit there are Shadow Flame Rush variants which have existed, like your Storm Surge Rush variants, your Lichbane builds. There are burst builds there for Galio if you do need that agency or you're playing into matchups where you can't just default on Hollow Radiance. And overall, I think the pick's in a great spot at the moment. Pretty easy to play as well. Like, he's one of the easier mid lanes to kind of opt into. You can also just play the shove wave and like roam playstyle, which trivializes a lot of the mid lane kind of like things at the moment. So do kind of recommend him in that aspect. Sits as a solid S tier option. And then your two AP assassins, your Echo and your Diana. Both these champions performing really well at the moment. Diana's a deceptively good laner, like an incredibly good laner, one of the best laners in the game. The amount of damage she does, like just from trading with the sweeping Q, where she can just like do it off CD with like Scorch, Electrocute, and then just like look for those all-in angles. It's a pretty trivialized trading pattern, which most people can opt into if they need to. Obviously, this pick doesn't scale quite as well as some of the other options, which is why she can struggle a bit more. But I think moving mid-elo, I think she's one of the perfect options to kind of lean into at the moment. Just pretty strong across the board, and with that really oppressive laning phase, you can really take over games quite quickly. And Echo, this pick's been in a really good spot for both jungle and mid for a while now. I think especially in mid, back when they buffed the outgoing or ingoing, I think they buffed both outgoing and incoming Q damage, and the wave clear is really nice on him at the moment. He's definitely like benefited patch over patch, or not, okay, maybe not patch over patch, but like through the buffs he's received, combined with the AP itemization. I think he's really thriving as a mid lane option at the moment. These two picks traditionally don't get enough because they just aren't as popular as like the main or like the considered top at the top of the popularity mid laner pool, like your Yasuos and your Zeds and shit like that. So you're usually safe when you play these options from being nerfed in the next patch, and I do recommend them. So my recommendations are, like your Echoes, Dianas if you're looking for an AP assassin. Galio is a great counter pick. Vlad's a great scaling option. Pantheon's a great AD lane bully and nullifier. Kenin's a bit more niche, Kale's a bit more niche, and then there's a lot of really good traditional options in the A tier. Some of the niche options within the A tier are also really nice if you can opt into them. I think you've got a good amount of variety going there for you, and yeah, just thank you guys for watching. See you in the next one. Goodbye.